The Center for Audit Quality presents Profession in Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Profession in Focus. I'm Cindy Fernelli, the Executive Director of the Center for Audit Quality, and I'm very pleased today to have with me Lou Ferguson, who is a board member at the PCAOB. So Lou, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Cindy, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before we get into the substance, I think there's something you need to tell all of us, is there not?
Yes, there is. I need to say, as we have to say at the beginning of all of our public statements, that the remarks that I'm about to make are my own remarks and do not necessarily reflect any of the positions of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board or its members or staff.
Very good. So now that we've got that official piece of business out of the way, what I would like to talk to you today about is the PCAOB's Audit Quality Indicator Project. So you've published a concept release seeking comment on AQIs. Tell us, before we get into the AQIs, why did the PCAOB come forward with this concept release at this time?
Well, I think to understand this concept release, we have to go back a little bit in history and go back to 2008 to the final report of the advisory committee on the auditing profession that was convened by the United States Treasury. And that was a committee that was convened in response primarily to the financial crises of the early 2000s. They did an extensive report on the auditing profession and the kinds of things that needed to be done and how it needed to change. And one of their central recommendations was that there should be undertaken a study of whether it would be possible to achieve objective measures of audit quality and whether they would be effective, and if so, should they be mandatorily imposed on audit firms and to be made available to the public. So that was really the very beginning of the background of it. The PCAOB began its project in November of 2012. And so this is a project this is not just sprung full grown out of the head of the god this year. This is a project that has been percolating for quite some time. We did extensive outreach with roundtables, discussions with people, discussions with the members of the profession, with members of audit committees before we put pen to paper here.
And of course, the CAQ presented to the PCAOB our points of view.
Yes, you did. The CAQ had extensive dialogue with the CAQ on this. And in fact, you've been one of the leaders in looking at this. You probably were out front before we were on this.
Well, it's been a wonderful process in being able to communicate and share our points of view and vice versa. So I think we're going to end up with a good set of audit quality indicators. So that could be a good segue into, tell us a little bit about the indicators that the PCAOB has put forth that they would like people to comment upon.
Well, we've put forth a list, we're proposing, this is all a proposal, it's right, I would strongly put this in context and say that what we've put forward are simply discussion points. These are not things we necessarily believe or think are the right ones, the only ones. It's a way of getting a discussion and a dialogue started that I think will take some time to achieve what ultimately, if we're able to achieve anything, but what ultimately are the measures of audit quality. So we've put our measures in what I would call three buckets: people, or this is the accounting professionals, process, how the audit actually works itself, and results. And there are 28 of these measures, as I mentioned. I have to look down at my notes because I can't keep 28.
You don't have all 28 memorized?
No, I wish I did, but my memory has long since ceased to be able to do that. Shall I give you some examples?
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Okay. On audit professionals, we subdivide audit professionals really into three separate buckets: availability, competence, and focus. Now, on availability, we look at things like staff leverage, partner workload, manager and staff workload, technical accounting and auditing resources, and persons with specialized skill and knowledge. Under competence, we look at the experience of the audit professionals. That is, how many years have they had on the job? Two, industry expertise of the audit personnel. For example, if you're auditing a bank, how many of the people on the team, including the engagement partner and engagement manager, and how much of their time have they spent auditing entities in the financial service business? Turnover of audit personnel. Turnover seems to be very important. Do you have a new audit team, or do you have an audit team that's had experience with this company? You know, one of the things that's quite interesting is that academic research has showed that there tend to be a higher degree of audit errors or audit failures in the early years of an engagement. And I think that part of that comes from the fact that this has to do with the lack of familiarity with the audit personnel and the particular entity that's being involved. We look at other things like the amount of audit work that's centralized at service centers, the training hours for audit professionals. On Focus, we talk about audit hours and risk areas. What did you spend your time doing in this audit? Was it basically ticking and tying, or was it risk assessment? Was it really focusing on the difficult issues?
That one was particularly important in our feedback that we got from audit committee members when we talked to them about what they might think was helpful, was really that focus in on the risk areas. I think audit committees would find that useful.
And I think it's not only risk, but it's the period during the audit year, if you will, when you do that. The earlier there is focus on audit risk, the earlier you identify the difficult issues, the less likely you are to have trouble with audits.
So I gather in these other categories too, in processes and results, you've got categories for people to consider and to weigh in on.
Touch on those briefly more, because I think, to some ways, I think the things that the audit professionals are things that I think are the simpler things to measure. But just quickly on audit processes, things like tone at the top, independence, monitoring and remediation. What do you do when you find a problem in your audits? And audit results, it's things like you look at, have there been problems with financial statements? Were internal controls and going concern issues reported on a timely basis? Have there been enforcement matters? Has there been civil or criminal litigation growing out of the audit? Things like that.
So of the 28, the thought is that once you hear from people, you will try to whittle it down to a more manageable number?
I think so, because we're quite conscious of the fact that the primary users of these will probably be audit committees. They're already extremely busy. They have many, many issues to deal with during the year, and what they don't want to do is be burdened with a whole bunch of extra work. So what we want to do is try to get a focus on things, a limited number of measures that will be the most useful. So it's very important to us, and I would urge people who are watching this to write comment letters to us, because our comment period is still open. Help us identify which of these 28 measures will be most likely to be useful.
I think that's very a good call to action, so to speak. Now, I also know, though, that there are some audit committees now that are using these voluntarily. And there are also some of the firms who are publishing in their quality reports or transparency reports some of these types of metrics, particularly I think around the people part of that. And how do you feel about this organic, voluntary use of this kind of information here in the United States?
I think it's terrific. I mean, I'm a great believer. One of the geniuses of this country is our ability to innovate and things bubbling up from the private sector. I'm a great believer that you get better results from that than you do from things that are driven from the top down. So I'm delighted to see, I know one of the big four firms, for example, has already identified 13 measures of audit quality that they are disclosing at least to their clients, and they put in their public transparency report each year. Other firms are beginning to do the same thing. So I like to see that. I'm a believer in, to quote Chairman Mao, let 100 flowers bloom. I also think, though, that we have to have in mind that there may be a place for a regulator to come in and create a more uniform standard, to at least say this is a minimum and everybody needs to do this. I'm not saying I believe that firmly yet, but I'm open to that as a possibility. It seems to me that's one thing we need to keep in mind. But I'm delighted by the kinds of things that are happening in the profession, in the private sector on this.
Now, I don't want to let you go before we talk about what's going on outside of the United States in the audit quality indicator space, because you have the unique advantage of sitting on IFIAR, which is the group that has all of the audit regulators, or many of the audit regulators as their members. And you recently just chaired that group, and now you are still very active in one of the working groups.
Right.
What's going on worldwide with audit quality indicators?
Well, I think there's a lot of ferment and a lot of discussion about this, and two jurisdictions in particular are actually already doing things in it. In Singapore, for example, the Audit and Securities Regulator in Singapore, ACRA, has come out with a list of 8 audit quality indicators that they would like to see applied to basically all Singapore public companies. They've done this after extensive outreach to audit committees. They've held focus groups on this. And they came to the conclusion that these measures should be voluntary, should not be mandatory, but that they should be made available if an audit committee wants to see them. So you could ask questions. And they've also suggested that, and they've come up with 8 measures, but many of them are related to the kinds of things that I talked about in the PCAOB's report. So that's one thing that's happening. The other thing is in their 2014 activity report, the Swiss regulator has come up with a list of 8 audit quality measures based on their inspections of the audits of Swiss public companies. And this is a quite interesting report, because what it does is it doesn't disclose things by firm, and it gives ranges. It gives, for example, and it has again 8 quality measures that involve many of the things we've talked about here. And it will go from a minimum to a maximum. For example, if you're talking about staff leverage ratio, what did they find in their inspections? What was the minimum staff ratio? What was the maximum? But again, all of this is to give more information to audit committees so they can ask further questions. And what we need to keep in mind here, that the underlying purpose of this is to increase transparency. And maybe a good way to look at this is that the audit is a little bit like an iceberg. What the public or even an audit committee sees is the mere surface of it. You see the result of the audit report, you hear your discussions with the audit partner, but because so little of the actual work of the audit is transparent, it oftentimes, when you're trying to choose between auditors, it oftentimes reduces you to choosing on the basis of things like price rather than audit quality.
Inspection findings.
Inspection findings. Our thought is that, our inspection findings, exactly. Our thought is that if we can give more measures that will allow people to ask more intelligent questions, you then may be able to get choices made on the basis of audit quality. And audit firms will be able to compete on audit quality, which is really what their great strength should be. It shouldn't be price. The audit is too important for this to be a price-driven decision.
Well, and in your concept release, you speak very eloquently and many times about the importance of that dialogue, giving the audit committees the tools that will prompt these questions and getting this context out so they can really understand what these numbers mean. It's not just the numbers, right? It's the dialogue that goes around them.
It's the dialogue. And it's very, very important to understand that these audit qualities are not intended to be audit quality measures are not intended to be a report card. They're not intended to be a grade. They're intended to be a prompter of dialogue. They're to help people formulate questions to ask. The fact that you have a particular measure does not necessarily mean it's good or bad. It just raises a question to ask, get inquiry, and to get answers on. And if you're an audit committee and one of these measures prompts an inquiry and you get a satisfactory answer, that's fine, move on. So what we don't want people to do is think that we're going to try that these are things that you have to meet certain criteria. If you don't meet this exact criteria, the audit firm has failed. That's absolutely not what's intended here.
Well, Lou, this has been very helpful. I'm sure there's more to come, and so maybe we'll have you back for another Profession in Focus so that we can hear where the PCAOB is moving along. But until then, I want to thank Lou for being my guest and also thank all of you for watching this edition of Profession in Focus. I'll see you next time.